You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Chris, and as always, I'm joined by Saul.
Saul from Australia.
And Tom.
Hi, Tom from England.
And in this episode, we have a bit of a treat for you. We're joined by Adam Torel, the head of Third Window Films, to talk about their upcoming releases, film distribution, and their impact on contemporary Asian cinema. And at the end, we'll have a bit of a Q&A with questions from our listeners. But before all of that, welcome, Adam. So happy to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Several of our listeners likely have a few Third Window films on their shelves already, at least the ones in the UK, or like Saul in Australia, they may even have some films on their shelves without even realizing. So why don't we start with a bit of a sales pitch? What is Third Window Films and why should people pay attention to your releases?
Well, the whole point of Third Window Films, actually, I started off distribution working for Tartan Films, which people who of a certain age will certainly remember as being one of the forefront distributors of Asian cinema in the United Kingdom, but also, I guess, in the world. They moved to distribute in America as well. And, they were all about making Asian cinema extreme. And they brought so many films that I'm sure you all know about, like Audition and Battle Royale. And
Always.
Yes, so I'm sure the entry point into many people's lives for Asian cinema at the time. But their whole point was making Asian cinema extreme. It was all like, as much gore and horror. And I think for people in the UK, their idea of Asian cinema was either the extreme side or like Kurosawa and Ozu. And I wanted to show everything in between. So that's how I started Third Window Films about 16 years ago or so. And it was, the point of Third Window is to show those films that you wouldn't see otherwise. So the films that won't make it onto streaming platforms worldwide, that probably will only go to film festivals. And, there are a lot of interesting films, in Asia and nowadays what I'm focusing on in Japan, but there's so many great films that I think people really are missing out on. And that's the whole point of Third Window Films, is to get these films out there.
That's a really good pitch, Adam. So would you say that your personal taste and interest in film is a large part of what drives what you decide to release?
Yes, it's only my taste. So if people don't like my taste, then they're not going to like Third Window Films, to be honest. But I've got a quite a varied taste, but I always like films that are unique and interesting and original. So I try to find films that a bit off the beaten track, and directors like Sono or Shinya Tsukamoto, and also like to focus on quite young and upcoming directors. But yes, it's my tastes. Third Window Films is just a one-man company. It's just me been running it for this long. So anything I do, and I do it for myself, and I don't try to release films just for the sake of, I don't know, making money, or I'm not a business in that way. So it's I'm not very business-like, unfortunately. I wouldn't release some of the films that I have, to be honest.
That's great, Adam. So would you ever consider releasing a film that you didn't particularly like, but you felt that there was big viability for Third Window Films?
In order to, just releasing tiny Japanese independent films by themselves, yes, the Third Window Films will never become more recognizable. So there have been times that I've released films that, no, I do love, but basically, for example, I want to release films that will not get released. And I want to make it sure that these, for example, maybe some amazing small films have a chance to get out there. And if it wasn't for me or a company like mine, they wouldn't. And I find that to be a bit sad for the directors and the people who are involved in making the films. But in order to do that, for example, like, Takashi Kitano is one of my favorite directors, without a doubt. And Fireworks is one of my favorite films of all time. But I didn't actually really want to release those Takashi Kitano films that I did release, but I released them because everybody wants to see those films. Everybody wanted to see those films on Blu-ray, which at the time they had not been released, and obviously that would help me able to release some of the smaller titles on the back of that. It's I do love Kitano without a doubt, but I didn't feel the need to release those films because somebody was going to release them anyway. If it wasn't me, it would be someone else. And I think that's a bit pointless, to be honest. I always feel like I also DJ, and I'm a record collector, and I think when you're DJing, you can't just play like songs that no one has ever heard of for your whole set. Like you sometimes need to throw in a bit more of a well-known track so that people come on the dance floor, and then you can play them a minor track afterwards once they're already there, and then they'll be more open to listening to that. So I've worked on films like Takashi Kitano films that allow me to get those like minor films in immediately after.
I see that's an excellent analogy about the DJ. I love that, Adam, and I appreciate obviously that you need to push for some of the larger releases, and it allows you to shine a light on some of the stuff that would perhaps go unheard of or undiscovered, and that's great because we at Talking Images all love learning about films that have gone under the radar.
Yeah, I usually put my most obscure films immediately after a major title release. That's usually how I schedule things. Balance like a big one and a small one. It's otherwise, if I put too many small ones, people just people have very short attention spans nowadays. So you really need to balance things out. But at the same time, it's not like I'm going to release some major studio film just for the sake of it. I mean, I still need to like the films, and that's why. For example, like Takashi Kitano, I still love those films. I just, I thought that it was a bit pointless to release them, to be honest.
Certainly, and I could understand the passion there, because I think if I was responsible for a distribution company like yourself, I'd want to make sure that everything reflects my taste, and I suppose that retains the integrity of what you're doing. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess the whole point. I mean, and I did sort of learn this when I was working in a company like Tartan, and before that, when I was a fan of films, we're all, I mean, it depends on how old you are and what generation you are in terms of being a film collector, but they're all, whether it be music or film, they're labels that you're drawn to because of the films that they release. Obviously, an obvious example would be Criterion, or nowadays you've got companies like Arrow, and it's the same in the music industry, where it was a little different back in the past because there wasn't so much information about films written on the internet, and obviously there was times obviously before the internet and VHS, which is a bit of my time. But you would buy the next film by that label because you trusted what that label was bringing to you, and you'd buy it because it was the next Criterion film, whether you knew what the extra film was you were buying. I mean, A24 is also an example of that nowadays. But it was important also with Third Window Films that, like, even if you didn't know the title, which you obviously probably wouldn't because it was a very small Japanese minor title, that you got into what the type of films that I was releasing as Third Window Films. And that's why the reason actually I did this is because of Tartan films, because Tartan obviously got us all of a certain age into Asian cinema with films like Battle Royale and Audition. But as they kept on saturating the market with just crap, long-haired ghost films, very derivative horror films from Asia, we were buying all these titles that at the time, obviously, they were expensive as well. I mean, and they were bare bones discs. You'd pay like £20 for a DVD with it that had very poor quality image and just a trailer as an extra. And every time you'd fork out 20 quid, and the films would just get worse and worse. And you thought, I don't want to trust this company anymore. I think that's one of a million reasons why Tartan went under. So it's very important to me that people buy into the brand and will take a chance on films that they don't know.
I think that's a very interesting point about brand trust, because definitely with things like the Criterion Collection, and when they're releasing like Michael Bay films like The Rock and Criterion, it does sort of make you think, well, is that really such a great brand? Is it just because it gets a Criterion release? Is it necessarily a good film? Or like Wes Anderson films, like automatically come out in Criterion, regardless of how well received they are.
I think when it comes down to it, the difference between Criterion and me is that because I'm a one-man company, I can continue to do these things. But Criterion, and obviously now Arrow, because Arrow have been taken over by The Hut, which is one of the biggest companies out there, they end up being corporate, whether or not their staff are anti-corporate, or they try not to. They do end up becoming corporate because they need to pay all the staff that are getting that they need. I mean, the bigger the company gets, the more staff they need. The more staff they have, the more money they need to do. So therefore, they released the Rock and Armageddon. So, you know,
Yeah.
that's the difference. You know, when you become a corporation or a big company, you need to do these things. And because I do so much in house, I've never wanted to. I mean, you can't say sell out, but I've never wanted to become bigger. It would just become. It would. I'd lose any passion that I had left. Would just evaporate.
No, yeah, no, I totally agree with that because, yeah, no, Third Window name does seem to be really good in that regard. And like you say, with like Criterion, they're just trying to like meet the demands of the market, and therefore they're releasing anything that's going to be popular. I did have a question though, because you did talk about that with like a lot of films, you're releasing like wider known films, which lets you then release lesser known films. So I'm thinking particularly with Tsukamoto and the Tetsuo films because they're, of course, available on other labels compared to some of his rarer stuff, which you can only really get on Third Window. I was just wondering how the sales of like Tsukamoto's better known films go compared to his lesser known films, given that lesser known films can only come from you, really, whereas the better known films can be bought from other brands.
Well, the thing about the Tsukamoto titles, and one of the abilities that I have being based in Japan and being able to give me, I mean, actually, Tetsuo I released on Blu-ray 10 years ago, but I think people are only finding out about it being on Blu-ray through Arrow's release of last year. So, you know, obviously they're a bigger company, but you know, those Tsukamoto titles, obviously they're very big, and they're big sellers for me, all of them for the most part. But yes, mainly the major ones like Tetsuo and Tokyo Fist and Bullet Ballet. But whether or not they were on other formats, I think they were only available on Blu-ray for a long time and many years only through me, and that did give me an advantage. But then, yes, if you're looking at his sort of less popular titles, if you were to say, like Kotoko, they haven't been. In fact, Kotoko, I never even recouped the money it cost to buy the film in the first place. So, you know, when it does come down to it, I think people everywhere just want to watch films that they know about ahead of time, and that's the classic Tsukamoto films like Tetsuo. Though in fairness, I think Kotoko is without a doubt one of his best films, and is really quite criminally underseen, considering he's such a well-known director and people love him so much. Maybe that's changed a little within the last year or two because of Arrow putting it out in the US, but you know, for so many years, I had the only release of it in the world outside of Japan, and it didn't sell.
Yeah, no, that's such a shame because yeah, I've only really got into Tsukamoto this year. Like I saw Haze last year, which is a fantastic, closed, room, where on earth is he type of thriller. But I've only really got into like Beyond Tetsuo this year, and just found like a lot of great stuff. Like even that Goblin film, I can't remember the exact title of it, but that's just such an amazing, creative, imaginative film, and yet it never gets talked about as much as his other films do.
Hiroko the Goblin just hasn't been more widely available. One of the reasons why a lot of companies in the world don't distribute so many Japanese films is because Japanese studios are very hard to work with. They're really a pain to work with. And those other titles from Tsukamoto, other than Hiroko the Goblin and to a part Gemini, all the copyright of those films were owned by Tsukamoto. So they were very easy to remaster, very easy to get out there. And that's probably one of the reasons why those films are more seen than something like Hiroko the Goblin, which was handled by a studio for a very long time. And just this year, that studio's relinquished the rights. So now, from this year, it will be released by myself and a lot of other companies worldwide. And therefore, now we'll start getting talked about a lot more. But all in all, I think Tsukamoto is without a doubt the best contemporary film director from Japan because of his consistency. He's never really made a bad film. I mean, unless you think Tetsuo 3 is not that great, which it's not that great. But he's made since 1985 or so. You know, with Denshu Kozo or 86, well, mid to late 80s to now, he's made what 15 films or so, and they're all a 7 or above in terms of their quality, and they're all 90 minutes or very easy to watch. They all look great. They all stand the test of time. They're all unique. He's a fantastic unique director, and there are many Japanese directors out there like Sion Sono for one who have that sort of unique originality to them, but their consistency in terms of filmmaking is all over the place. I mean, Sono's made a lot more films than Tsukamoto, and yet he's made a lot less good films than Tsukamoto. So, I think Tsukamoto is just really, he's an amazing. He's a director. He's a fantastic person. He's got so much passion to him. He's a great actor on top of it. He's really one of the people that I respect the most in the whole entire Japanese film industry.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting comparison between Tsukamoto and Sono because they both tend to do really extreme, really interesting, really out there films. I haven't seen, I guess, a lot of Sono films by comparison. I've probably only seen 7 or 8 because he's just done so many of them. The ones that I have seen have been of fairly high consistency of quality, but I guess if I saw more of them beyond the ones that have been promoted, maybe my opinion of that would change. But, just stuff like Tag is just like an amazing, mind-blowing film to me. But yeah, getting back to Tsukamoto, I'd probably agree with quality, even though there's some like Vital, which I didn't really get into too much, or I guess the third Tetsuo film. I'd say, yeah, none of them are really bad as such. I mean, the worst ones for me maybe be a little bit mediocre. It is interesting about the third Tetsuo because I don't know about other countries, but in Australia it's hasn't been widely available, and I couldn't actually stream it through your website, so I had to stream it through Spamflix, which is a Portuguese streaming service. So I don't know if you've had any issues with availability or whether that's one selling a bit better because it's less widely released worldwide.
The third Tetsuo, I didn't take on the rights to it because I don't really like it that much. And also, the reason why the third Tetsuo is not as readily available worldwide is because it's a film that's handled by a foreign sales company. Going back to my points about sales agencies, that's the reason why a lot of films are seen or not, is who owns the right and who's selling it. And there are many examples of Japanese films like that are handled by foreign sales agents, as in sales agents of films that are not based in Japan, and therefore they can be more expensive and they can be a little harder to work with as well. Another example, for example, Sono's Why Don't You Play in Hell is handled by a big French sales agency who asks for a lot of money because of the company they are. So, a lot of people always say, why don't you put this film out or why don't you put that film out? But it's not as easy as that, to be honest. There's a lot of mess that you have to deal with. And, I think the great thing about Tsukamoto is with the majority of his titles, obviously not Tetsuo 3, but with the majority of titles, he owns the rights, and therefore it's very easy to distribute them.
Okay, I've got one more question. I don't really want to, but I don't know if it's a good point to lead into or not. But just with the distribution, obviously I'm based in Australia, and the titles that are available to stream on your website, I mean, it's awesome or whatever. Like whenever I search for a film in, Google, it comes up with a Vimeo link, and I go, oh, awesome, I can stream this online. But then it says, well, no, you can only stream it if you're in the UK or Ireland. So I don't know if this is the right place to ask in the podcast, but I am sort of interested in the issues that are going on with that because obviously you've got an extensive catalogue. I'd be happy to rent most of the films that are available from them, but the option isn't really there if you're outside the UK or Ireland.
Yeah, this is also another point where I think a lot of people around the world, especially on forums and film fans, are saying, why is this disc region locked, or why is this film only available to stream in this country or not? And that's the whole point of distribution, especially for smaller films or independent companies' distribution. So not studios like Warner Brothers. So I'll also talk about this because I produce films, and before I started producing films, working just as a distributor, I was also saying, why can't I release this film, all region, because then more people can see it. But when I'm looking at it from the point of a producer, if you make a film, it costs a lot of money to make a film, and you need to obviously try to make that money back, which means you need to sell it to as many territories as possible. If you sell it to one country, they will buy the rights to that film at the cost in comparison to sort of the size of the country and how much films usually sell there, and how many people are in that country and what sort of country it is in terms of film loving fans and this and that and the economy and all that. So if I were to sell a film to England and they were to pay only a small amount, which would be the amount that an English company would pay for a film, and they were to release that disc, make it available, unlocked and available to the world, and then available on their website to stream worldwide, then I, as a producer, or if I were a sales agent of a film, would have only made a tiny bit of money, and then that film would be available worldwide, and I wouldn't be able to sell it anywhere else. It's the same with film festivals, and like if you were to have nowadays of online film festivals because of the pandemic, if a film played in a film festival that was online and open to the world, then that film wouldn't be able to go to any other film festivals because its exclusivity is gone. As a distributor, when I'm buying rights from a Japanese company, I can only buy rights for the territory that I work in, which is England. I'm a UK-based company, and Third Window Films is UK-based. So if I were to buy worldwide rights, it would cost a lot of money up front, money that I wouldn't be able to recoup. So I can only buy my territory, which requires it to be locked for that region, which is, B or for Blu-ray and 2 for DVD. So that's the reason why many people in other countries can't see the discs, and why I always say just buy an all-region Blu-ray player, because they're not that expensive. And, if you really want to see all these different films that aren't going to be released in your country, then spend like 50 quid or $50 to either buy a Blu-ray player that can easily be hacked through a remote control, or buy an all-region player, and therefore you can watch anything you like, or use a VPN or something. I mean, obviously I shouldn't be saying these things, but it's not that hard to legally, if you want to see a film from my site or buy a Blu-ray, it's not that hard to get around it in a sort of semi-legal way.
You heard it here. Use a VPN or hack your Blu-ray.
It's when I was and I obviously first started off in buying videotapes, because of VHS, it was obviously before DVD, and that was the only way to see a film, was to watch a third generation videotape, especially for Asian films that weren't that accessible at the time. And I was living in America, and there was a company called Video Search of Miami, and they would send you these massive like handwritten catalogs or typewriter catalogs with just film titles on it. And you would choose the titles that sounded the most interesting, and then mail them your money in the post, and they would send you some like dodgy VHS tapes, because it was the only way to see films, and they looked awful, and most of them didn't have subtitles, but that's all you could see. And then things changed with VCDs and then DVDs, and at the time, still living in America, I just bought a DVD player off Amazon that I could crack with a remote control, press 3 numbers, and therefore I could watch all the films that I wanted to see around the world, and buy them from Yes Asia to get Asian films, or different other places, Benson's World in England, if anybody remembers that. But if you really want to see films, it's not that hard to get an all-region player or use a VPN and watch them. I mean, it's still supporting films in general, and it's not like you're having to resort to piracy. So I think there are ways around it that aren't that expensive.
Yeah, no, sure. Yeah, thanks for the response. I do have a region A and a region B player, so that's not the issue for me. The issue for me is probably just the import time and importing it from overseas, and the time it takes to arrive. I mean, I don't really haven't really added much to my physical Blu-ray collection over the past few years. It's been mainly streaming. But what you've said there does sort of make sense. If the producers don't want to sell the rights to more than one company, or they're only going to sell it for an expensive amount, then I really need to contact, I guess, the film producers themselves if I want an Australian release, rather than trying to lobby your company to have it available here.
Yeah, I think buying Australian rights, it probably wouldn't be that much more expensive, but I don't obviously am not set up in Australia to have a sort of logistical setup in order to sell things as easily over there. And I don't think it would really increase the sales to a point where I could cover the cost that I would be asked for in order to get Australian rights, to be honest. You have bigger companies like Arrow, or if you're looking at studios like Warner Brothers and all that have worldwide rights on films, or they buy English language territories, and therefore they can get them out in this country or not. But unfortunately, I don't have those resources, being just one person on my computer. So unfortunately, I can't help. But I think VPNs are a great piece of technology if you want to stream something from. I'm not gonna I'm not gonna say too much about it, because I'll get in trouble. But it's a useful tool.
Definitely a useful tool, Adam. And I'd also say that I love that you went through the kind of same history with getting into films as perhaps I did with mail order and just taking a punt on films where you're not really sure what they're about, but they sound interesting. And I can remember when I used to browse the aisles in HMV, and one of the first Tartan Asia Extreme films that I picked up was Tetsuo, the Iron Man, and it was based just purely on the cover artwork and the description on the box. I'd heard nothing about that in the film whatsoever, and it just blew me away. It was brilliant, and I often wonder if some of that magic is lost today because a lot of films are just readily available for streaming across the world, you know. But I'd like to know more about... Oh, go on, sorry, if you had something to
I really wish there were more people that had the same mindset. I think that it's too easy nowadays to just click on a button and learn about any film and watch a film. And I think people don't even give films attention anymore because they could just click on another button and watch a film for free. And I think people of a certain generation, I mean, I'm not even that old, but I just was from that from that generation. I mean, I don't want to start saying like, you know, like think of the good old days or something like that. But
Yeah.
you know, as somebody who works in distribution, does this for a living, you know, I really don't like working nowadays because there's no fun in it. You know, there's the audiences complain. I don't want to complain myself too much, but I think people, you know, it used to just be like watching a film was great, and now it has to be like 4K or UHD, or it has to be, it's this quality and it has to be in this box, or it has to, you know, be available here and there. And you know, from my times, yes, you'd have to. There was no way you could find out about a film. I would have these massive encyclopedia books, and you just have to like browse through them. And if you didn't know of a film, and then this film, and then that was only obviously for major films as well. So when you're dealing with Asian cinema at the time, it was just like buying it because the title sounded good or the artwork looked good, and films were a lot more expensive to buy back in those days as well. You know, it's not like nowadays you can get like a Blu-ray for like £5 or something like that. You know, then it was like, you know, in the DVD time, it was definitely 20 pounds for a DVD with poor quality and no extras. And before then, it was even harder and more expensive with the VHS tapes as well, and even worse quality. But it was that time and effort that you used to put into discovering something, and you felt sort of connected. I mean, it's also similar with other things like record collecting or if you collect a manga or something like that, the time and effort you put in to finding something or discovering something you didn't know about, and then, you know, maybe crap or maybe good, but that time has gone into it, that you feel a sort of connection to what you're watching. And you know, I think that's gone nowadays in this Netflix. I really sound like an old man, which I'm not that old, but you know, it's really that magic of is gone, and people. You know, it's really hard to look at message boards and look at forums nowadays when people are complaining about one thing or another. But it's just disappointing, to be honest. You know, it's all about, in my way, it's all about watching films, and it's for one of the reasons why I moved to Japan, because in Japan there still is that old-fashioned structure of having holdbacks and going to the cinema and it not being available to rent on DVD for 6 months after, and then it would be on rental first and then buy afterwards, and then no video on demand and all that. And if you wanted to see a film, you had to go watch it in the cinema. So I think Japan is one of those few places left in the world which it isn't about the format, it's about the film. So it's why I enjoy living here, to be honest.
Yeah, that does sound great, and it's all about that mystery of not knowing whether what you're about to watch, whether it's going to be any good or not. And that's why I love going to film festivals where you've just got a slate of brand new films, some of them premieres, and you have no idea, no preconception of whether they're going to be any good or not. And I love that sense of discovery. And I suppose so when you first got into cinema, it was that sense of discovery that you loved. And did that was that one of the main reasons that saw you take the career path that you did?
Yeah, for sure. Because like I said, I lived in America, and I lived in a bit of a nowhere of America in Florida when I was a teenager, and there was luckily an independent cinema there and an independent video store. And that video store, actually, I don't know why it was in this small town in Florida, but it was probably one of the best video stores in the world. They had about 40,000 films, and I ended up working there for many years.
Wow.
But being in places like that, the whole concept of distribution is really something that made me want to do it, because films are not like nowadays when you have any film available that touch the button worldwide or available in some way or form. It was all about distributors that would find these films and bring them to your local cinemas and then put them out in physical formats, whether it be VHS or DVD. But that was the way that your connection to watching these films, because it wasn't available otherwise. And I lived in this small town where there was this independent cinema, and I saw, when I was about 12 years old, I saw like a Ringo Lam film I think it was a City on Fire or Prison on Fire, one of the two.
Right, yeah.
And I saw it in a local cinema that had a local film festival, and that got me into Asian cinema. I was into art house and foreign, well, general term foreign cinema at the time, and that madness of Ringo Lam and Hong Kong cinema in the late 80s and early 90s was really something that blew my mind. Because if you had been watching, even if you're a big film fan at the time, watching that heroic bloodshed of John Woo and Ringo Lam and Choi Hark was something so new. I mean, obviously it's unique and it's original because it's a completely different culture. Asia was so different and so less accessible. I mean, especially places like Japan. I mean, during the time, it seems so much further away from where we were in Europe or America. And watching those sort of films, like, you could never imagine a film like that getting made in America or in Europe. And then as things progressed with Hong Kong and Korean cinema, you saw films, and then you come on to the battle royales and all that sort of stuff. But these films that were so over the top and so unique, and it made me really, really love Asian cinema that whole time. I mean, but at the same time, the only way I could see those films was like Tai Seng VHSs. And then obviously Tartan came in and made it a little more accessible to when DVDs came in. And I thought, distribution is something that is something that's necessary to get these films out there. I had studied film production and television production in university, and but I didn't want to make more films because there's so many films out there that are not getting seen. So I thought getting into distribution would be the perfect way to help films, especially Asian films that weren't making it over to the West, get out there. So that's really how I got into it.
That's excellent, Adam. What was the first project that you really got involved with in terms of distribution?
So when I got into Tartan, I'd moved back to England, and I'd loved Tartan because as a fan, and I knew somebody who was a producer in England, that he introduced me to the boss of Tartan, and I started working as an intern there. And I think, like all companies that you look at from the outside, I mean, I'm sure maybe even these companies like Criterion may be an example. When you're a DVD collector or a film fan, you look at it and you think it's amazing. And when you go in and you work for these companies, like, it ends up being completely the opposite. Like, they end up being quite corporate, and and a lot of the people that work there, in fact, don't really like films, or they don't really watch films, or
That sounds awful.
I mean, it's just what do you expect? I mean, like, I think if you had offices of people that were like real film dorks, the companies would probably just go under, because they'd be like buying these films that they all loved, and the audience wouldn't get into it, and therefore the company wouldn't make any money. So I expected, before I came into Tartan, that everybody would be like me there, and the only person who was like me there was like another intern.
But you obviously stay afloat, though, and you've been staying afloat for a very long time. So how do you manage to do it?
I managed to stay afloat because it's just me. Like I said, the more people you have working, the more money that it costs to run a company. The size of the offices and the rent and the electricity bills and the people's salaries. Like, you need to do things that you wouldn't want to do otherwise to pay all those people. So literally, I've never had an office. I've never had any staff. Initially when I first got into it, obviously there was a lot of things I didn't know how to do. For example, subtitling or poster design or editing, or a lot of these things that I didn't know how to do. And over the years, So I would initially outsource them, like poster design or any of those sort of things, like marketing, press. I would outsource them to people, and obviously that costs money. So I just thought, like, I'll outsource things once, and then I'll learn what they've done, and then I'll incorporate those things so I can do it myself. So if I outsource to a press company, I would just see who reviewed all the films, and then try to get in contact with them and make connections with them so that I could go directly to them next time. Or if I outsourced a poster design, I would see I would ask for layout artwork, and I would see how I would learn how to use Photoshop and all these things by reading books, and then learn how to design myself. Or if it was subtitling, I would outsource to a company, and then afterwards I would break down what they've done and then teach myself how to do it. So I've spent all these years learning how to do things myself, so that I don't need to spend the money to ask somebody else to do it. So it's become yes, just all myself. And if my computer broke, I don't know what I'd do, to be honest, because everything is either in my computer or in my head. And if I were to get ill, then I'd be in trouble. So I have to work non-stop and hope that I don't get ill.
Just to be clear, you do absolutely everything yourself. Like when we go to your website, all the poster art, it's you. All of the advertising for it, it's you. That's incredible.
Some of the illustrated posters, I can't illustrate yet. I need to learn. So I do outsource some of the illustrated posters. But if you're looking at the layout of posters, I mean, most of the time it's mostly just the Japanese posters that have been altered in one way or another. So I do that, and then set the layouts out, and yes, obviously do all the Facebook and Twitter and website, and any mails or anything comes in, it's always just to me. And then, if it, in terms of the DVD bonus features, I do all the interviews that see on the discs, unless they were initially done when the film was made by the Japanese company. They're all done by me, usually in my house. The audio commentaries, I'll go to the director with my computer, and we record the audio commentaries, and then I'll subtitle them myself. And I edit a lot of basic editing as well, as much as I can. I do it myself. But then when it comes to, for example, getting my titles onto Amazon so that they can be sold, that's where I need a company like Arrow Films, who can actually work as a middleman to get my titles onto Amazon. When I was based in the UK, I would post stuff out myself. I would just go to the post office every day and post stuff out. But because I'm also producing and doing lots of other things in Japan, I need a company like Arrow Films to actually handle the physical distribution of my titles to Amazon. So that's the only thing I sort of don't do myself.
So, speaking of physical distribution, I'm just curious because I've never been on the inside of this. So, in terms of like getting your films out on Blu-ray, do you like make one master of it and then send it to a factory that produces the Blu-ray and the plastic for it and everything?
Yes, and obviously that's another reason why I need a company like Arrow Films, because if I were to go to Sony and say, like, can you press up like 1,000 copies of this Blu-ray, it would cost a fortune. And there are ways nowadays that even I think Amazon and some of these companies do that, like sort of very small scale distribution. Like if you want to put out a CD or a book or something, you can go direct to these companies, but it costs a fortune because you're only making limited runs. So for many years, it's now Arrow. It used to be Metrodome, and it used to be World Cinema, a company called World Cinema, who are now owned by Curzon. I needed to get my titles handled by a larger company who were usually making like tens of thousands of discs through Sony, so that I can get their vastly negotiated rates, and therefore I ask Arrow to place an order with Sony to print up 1,000 discs of a master that I've just sent over, and then Sony send those discs onto a warehouse, which Arrow then handle the sort of back and forth between that warehouse. Like, as an independent distributor, it would be impossible for me to do these things myself, but it would just make the cost per disc so high that I would need to put the sales prices up a lot, and therefore nobody would probably buy them, to be honest. So I do need these sort of bigger companies like Arrow to act as those middlemen.
Arrow has been coming up several times in this conversation so far. How is your working relationship with them, especially considering how they seem to be releasing many of the same films as you in different markets?
for the years I've been switching through these middlemen distributors. I mean, there aren't as many as there used to be, and because obviously distribution is dying up and physical distribution is dying, there aren't that many of these companies out there. Initially, it was a company called Metrodome, who were a distributor on themselves, and that company Metrodome ended up going bankrupt years ago. But they would handle mine, and over the years, yes, it changed. And a few years ago, I went to Arrow because they are a quite similar company in the fact that they're a boutique label that work on sort of more out there films, and they had a very solid fan base. So I thought it would be a very good company to work with. But we're not officially connected. Like, they don't finance my films, and we don't work together on any films. In fact, when they released the Tetsuo films, despite the fact that I was the person who originally remastered all of them with Tsukamoto, I didn't know that they were going to release them until they were released.
Oh, wow.
People think that, we're connected in that way. And I thought that they'd at least, ask me or say, we want to release these films in the US, but I didn't know about it until they released them themselves. So there's no actual connection to us other than the fact that they are a middleman between me and Amazon, and they allow me to sell my titles through their website, which obviously, considering their huge reach, is a very good thing for me. But at the same time, they're a big corporation now owned by the Hut, which, if you don't know about them, they own Zavi, and also they were supposed to be the sponsors for Manchester United Football Club this year. So they're a very, very big company, and because of that, they do charge me an awful lot, to be honest. So it's not as nice as I wish it was, to be honest. And actually, it used to be nicer, but ever since they got taken over, they've really upped their prices.
I'd love to know a bit more, Adam, about how you pick your films. I mean, do you seek out films at film festivals? Do you have companies that contact you directly regarding new releases? So what kind of avenues do you have to take to acquire new films for your label?
Well, initially, yes, I would go to a lot of film festivals, and in a lot of the big film festivals like Cannes, you have the film festival where they just screen the films. Then you have these things called markets, where there are loads of big auditoriums, and there's loads of film companies selling their films to buyers like myself. And in those places, you'd see all the companies, including all the Asian companies, and they'd have their booths, and then they'd be trying to sell titles that weren't released yet, or their catalog titles. And in those places, you'd go to these people and these sales agents, and they would say, we've got this new title that we think probably suits you, and then they'd give me a DVD to watch it, and if I liked it, then obviously I'd ask them about acquiring it. So that was one way of finding out about a lot of films before anyone else. And film festivals obviously are another way, because the audience reaction can be a big part of also buying a film. It's not just that I like the film, but lots of people seem to like it, and therefore it's probably a good film worth acquiring. But when you're dealing with all these middlemen like sales agents, obviously the prices for these things get more and more expensive. So over the years, I've started to work closer with directors and producers so that I can get in at the very beginning on titles that are still, I could acquire for either very cheap, or I could take for free in exchange for example, handling worldwide film festivals. So my job has sort of changed, not just from distribution, but also to international sales myself, or be also getting into production. So, for example, films like One Cut of the Dead was a film that I had got in at the very beginning and took the worldwide rights, and then distributed it in England myself, and then sold the rights to other countries, like companies like Shudder as well. And also, obviously, I brought that film to film festivals worldwide. So yeah, that's one way of getting in early. But I think being based in Japan nowadays allows me to see films at a very early age, especially for independent films that probably wouldn't even go to film festivals. I think people really, with Japanese films in particular, they're only seeing a very small amount of Japanese films that are getting out there compared to the amount of films that are actually made and released each year. It's over 600 films that are getting released here, and to be honest, most of them are awful. But what I would do is being able to speak Japanese, I would go to the cinema in Tokyo 5 times a week and see everything that I could. and it's awful because they're really shit a lot of the time. But can I curse on here? I think. So,
Yeah, of course.
Oh yeah, no worries, no worries.
that's really, really shit. A lot of these films, but you know, 1 in a million films, you're able to grab a either see potential in a director like Shinichiro Ueda, the director of One Cut of the Dead, who I saw his short films at a small screening here, and therefore followed him to be able to get One of the Cut of the Dead early, or you see a very good independent film, and you can get in there before anyone else, and therefore gives you exclusivity and makes it very cheap to buy. But I watched a lot of films, and I also, as I work as a film festival program as well, I watch the studio films, so I'm connected to a lot of the Japanese production companies. It's you have to really, it's a lot of work to try to find anything good, because most of them are awful. But you know, back in the days, it used to be a lot different, because when I was really doing my best in terms of releasing was probably around 2010, 11, and there were a lot of really, really good Japanese films at the time, and nowadays they're just none, and that is it's really hard, because you know, I I want to release films, but there's just no films to release. So in that case, I need to go and maybe focus more on catalog titles, older films that haven't been released before, or haven't made it to Blu-ray or something. So it's personally, I'd love to release some more small Japanese quirky comedies like I used to, but there's just none around.
Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, Japanese cinema has been dying for a long time. You know, the Japanese film system is really crap. They have this thing called a film committee system, and the way that Japanese films are made is that, I mean, this has been going on for quite a long time. You know, but Japanese films, even independent films, are made in a way that, like, in order not to put risk onto one company, so that in case the film bombs, that one company goes down, they have lots of small companies make a film together. But the problem is that all those companies are basically not film related. I mean, they're like music company and a publishing company, and a film, a model agency and a musician agency, and they put all these companies together and make a thing called a film committee. And that film committee makes a film, but because there are all these people involved with it, they all are there for a reason. So they want their new song to be in that film, or they want their manga to be adapted, or they want some tie-up by putting their new model or new idol into the film. And it's a sort of very old-fashioned, like American type system. And the problem with Japanese is that if you know anything about Japanese salaryman culture, it's quite robotic, and you have all these suits that can't decide themselves. It's a very Japanese, don't like to take on responsibility. So you have all these different companies, all these different salarymen for each company in meetings, but nobody can make a decision at all. And anything, even if you want to change the color of something, every single salaryman has to go back to their company and then ask the person above them, who asked the person above them, and then above them, and then comes down and down and down, and then back to these meetings. And it takes like 3 weeks to change a color of a website or something. So the creativity obviously gets lost in that way, and you know, it can be very hard to make anything decent. Also, I think you know, Japan is too. If you've lived in Japan, or if you've been to Japan, it's have you guys all been here for a long bit of time?
I've never been to Japan, sadly. I'd love to, but I haven't had the opportunity yet.
No, I've never been to Japan.
Me neither. So we're all allowed to look a bit.
Japan is a very clean, very organized. It's fantastic to live. It's a really great, but it's, you know, it's too clean and too nice and too, you know, there's no stress. I mean, there's stress of like the robotic life of going to work for long hours. It's very tough to work in Japan because of the long hours you have to work and the company structure. But there's no troubles. It's like you can have like a 5-year-old. You see, I mean, when I first came to Japan, coming from London, and you know, London is a pretty decent place to live, and yet you wouldn't have like a 5-year-old going to school by himself on the train. I mean, it's even 10-year-olds. I mean, taking the night bus home or something, you'd be pretty scared. But in Japan, like even in Tokyo, like just kids like 5 years old who like go to school themselves on the train. I mean, it's insane. So this it's such a safe place that I think it's a bit boring, to be honest, in terms of I think the reason why you were seeing a lot of good cinema from for example Korea is because Korea has so much. It was a military dictatorship until the late 80s, late 70s. So within a generation, you had this life of like no democracy, and then you have this constant threat of war with North Korea, and then at the same time this heavy influx of American pop culture, and all the young kids today and the next generation is completely opposite. And there's so much that breeds creativity there, and in Japan they don't have that. So I think Japanese cinema just is showing that there's not much going on in life here. I mean, if you watch any Japanese dramas, they're like some guy broke up with his girlfriend or something, and then he's like really depressed, and like that's about it. I mean, for the majority of Japanese dramas, they've got no stress points. But then if you look at Japanese cinema of the 80s, like Sogo Ishii films, Shinya Tsukamoto, Sono, Sion, all those people came from a time in Japan that was like pretty crazy. Like in the early 80s, there was like drug culture, and there was like Yankee. It's these sort of like gang cultures. Lots of fights, lots of good music, lots of craziness. Like that breeds good creativity, which through filmmakers breeds interesting films. And really, there's the young kids in Japan nowadays are very apathetic. They don't have that punk or passion. There's no passion, I think, in the younger kids nowadays. And coupled with this sort of film committee system of like suits making films, I mean, it's like double bad, like so yeah, I think that's why you guys and myself, we're all talking about Tsukamoto, Shinya, and Sono, Sion, but like they're like 50s and 60-year-old people. I mean, there's no young people nowadays in Japan, unfortunately, compared to Korea or other places in Asia.
Yeah, and it is kind of interesting because when you think about contemporary Japanese films, you usually think of, anime films and the Studio Ghibli ones and the ones that come afterwards, things like A Whisker Away. But of course, that's not really the hard hitting, really out there dramas. That's, more fantasy. That seems to be, at least for a lot of, Japanese filmmaking, gets concentrated these days on the fantasy rather than on the down to earth grittiness of something like Tetsuo.
Well, I mean, Tetsuo is a fantasy. I mean,
You just call it too down to earth.
Oh, well, they're down to earth as in like more like everyday type of thing. I know it's quite fantastic with all the metal things, whatever happens to him, but it's an everyman's tale or whatever. It's not animals can talk and whatever, or like leaping through time or whatever that you get in like all the anime films that that have come out in the recent years.
Well, no, actually, I think there are a lot of because they're just not released overseas. But Japanese human drama tales are a dime a dozen, and they don't get seen overseas because they're not very good. You see those anime films and those fantasy films. I think it's all about our image. I mean, whether, like you said, if you're in Australia and you don't see that many Japanese films, you only see the films that are being distributed by there, and therefore those are the films that are either the big studio films or the anime, and therefore your idea of Japanese culture and Japanese cinema becomes that. And it was the same with Tartan Asia Extreme, is that people were thinking like Japan, like they're killing school kids every day, and like they're every person's got this long-haired ghost everywhere. But it's that's all we see, so that's what we think of as part of that culture. But Japanese human drama films are really like, they're like 400 of them every year, and they're awful because they're boring as hell, and they're incredibly poorly made in the fact that Japanese don't put a lot of time into post-production of films, so they're very flat. They don't have they don't look good, Japanese dramas for the most part. I mean, maybe you see the Koreeda films, but that's very different. They're big budget films, and Koreeda is obviously very talented, but he also has a lot of foreign input in terms of the way that he makes and releases films. Honestly, yeah, maybe it's for the best that a lot of these Japanese films aren't distributed. To be honest, they are really not so good, unfortunately, and that's probably one of the reasons why also I got into production here, and being a distributor, you can only distribute what's out there. And if there's nothing out there, then what can you do? So I think taking that step into film production myself allows me to make something more interesting, and or in the terms of, for example, handling international sales for films, finding those smaller films and getting them out there when they might not get seen. I think in this day and day of Netflix and video worldwide internet distribution, I think there is slightly a small space left in film distribution, especially in countries like Japan that have so many small films that don't get released.
I love the consistency there, because as a teenager, your thought was that you didn't want to get into production because there were so many films, and now, some decades later, you still have more or less the same view, but it's you want to get into production because there aren't that many films anymore.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think obviously also, when you're just, I talked to some other distributors similar to me a lot about this, but when you're a distributor, especially with Japanese companies are really hard to work with because of this film committee system. You have in Japan, there are every actor and every body in Japan, whether directors, they're owned by talent agencies, and these talent agencies are very controlling, and if you look up even for one example, Johnny's Entertainment, who are a music talent agency who own all the big Japanese bands, and they're so controlling, not only of the talents who they don't pay much and they put under these big contracts so they're not allowed to quit and they have to work non-stop, but they're also controlling about how they let the media access what they've done. So this Johnny's Entertainment company, for an example, they don't allow photos of their actors or their singers to be used on the internet. So, for example, if one of the actors was in a film and I wanted to distribute that film, I wouldn't be allowed to publicize any part of that film that actor had been in. I wasn't allowed to use a photo of that actor as on the cover of the DVD, or I wouldn't be able to on the website use any photo that had to do with an actor. I mean, it's insane when you think about it. So these insane rules that I'd have to abide with as a distributor means that you can only distribute the film as we've told you. So you can only use this poster, even if it's a fucking shit poster. You can only use this trailer, even if this trailer doesn't at all make this film look any good. And if you look at the Japanese trailers, I mean, they're awful. I mean, you can't imagine anybody outside of Japan will want to watch these films. But not being able to adapt those makes it very hard for myself as a distributor. So I think getting into production allows you to have more control in the way that a film gets out there. And I think that's is very important, because if you are told you have to release a film in a certain way, then it's just no fun, to be honest. And if it's no fun, then you don't really want to do it. You lose the passion involved. So I think that's how I sort of got into production. And also, yes, being able to help some of these Japanese directors get their films out there when they might not be able to in Japan, because actually a lot of these directors like Sion, Sono, Tsukamoto, Shinya, a lot of the directors that we know as Japanese or Asian film fans are not popular in Japan. In fact, there's always a correlation. If a film bombs in Japan, it will probably work overseas. And if a film is popular in Japan, it probably will bomb overseas. Because the films that are popular in Japan are awful. They're always television spin-offs. They look like they're made for television, no matter what you have the budget of. They're based on manga. People overseas may not know about. They have idols who play as the lead roles, so their acting is awful. They're really, really bad Japanese studio films. I mean, and yet these films from directors like Shion Sono, we all think of Shion Sono as this big Japanese director, but up until very recently, and that was not until he made a studio film in Japan, he was just, all his films lost money. I mean, it's also if you look at people like Kim Ki-duk as well in Korea, he can't even get he couldn't, he's dead now, but he couldn't even get theatrical releases of his films in Korea, and yet overseas, he's this big name. So Japan is quite weird like that. And I think getting it to being able to work with these directors who are more popular overseas than in Japan allowed me to sort of, help them get films made, which they couldn't get them made. I mean, I made a film with Sion Sono because he couldn't get it made in Japan. So I had to come in over and help him. So I think, yeah, that was a sort of like obvious route into production.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, because it's impressive that your very first production was with Sono, and granted, it's one of his probably more straightforward films, but it's a great one, a very emotional one. So, could you tell us a little bit about your experience working on Land of Hope and just working with Sion Sono, and how you continued producing?
Yes, I obviously worked as a distributor of Sion Sono films with Love Exposure, Cold Fish, and Himizo at the time, and I was a big fan. And he was obviously very popular overseas when those films obviously weren't actually popular in Japan. And Sion Sono is a very in the moment type of person. He's very creative, and he does things now and only now, and he doesn't look back at his films. He only wants to make new things. And Land of Hope was at a time, obviously, when the earthquake and the nuclear power plant at Fukushima had happened in Japan. He wanted to make a film about that, but because he was sort of critical, well, it was quite critical of nuclear power and Fukushima, no Japanese companies wanted to help him. So one of the producers of the film, who was Japanese, had a very international mindset, and I'd worked with her. It was a woman on some other films of his as a distributor, and she said, like, do you want to come over and help? And I came to Japan and helped with the financing and this and that. And that's actually how I learned about this film committee system, because that was also ended up being a film committee film. And I thought myself, I mean, going back to the point of like looking at things from the outside in terms of like, companies like Tartan, like, wow, Sion Sono, it's going to be like super independent, and, we're going to have so much creativity. And when you come to Japan, like, and you end up in a system like this, it's just like anything else. Like, it's the complete opposite of what you expect. And Sion Sono himself, of course, and his set is very creative and wild, but then behind it, it's still a Japanese film, and it still has this film committee system involved, and this nonsense about waiting 3 weeks to change the color of something. And it was so disappointing because I wanted to help Sion Sono. Maybe I was quite naive, actually, and maybe thinking it was more independent than it actually was, but it ended up being quite a sort of Japanese film committee type film. And I worked on it, but it, me and Sono wanted to do a lot more that actually a lot couldn't be done because of the way that the structure was involved in that setup, which is the way that all Japanese films are made. So I learned a lot about that, but then I also learned to do things more independently, like I always do. I watched other people, and then I learned how to do things myself, and I went on to making completely independent films after that. So with Uchida Eiji, who we were talking about earlier, the director of Grateful Dead, and Netflix is the naked director, we made a couple super independent films. So in that case, like everything, I did everything myself. I nearly killed myself working, doing absolutely every single aspect of that, from shooting the making of, I mean, obviously crowdfunding to raise the money so that no companies would get involved, and having to sell all my record collection and my clothes and everything like that to raise money.
Wow.
Then crowdfunding in multiple countries, in Japan and overseas, and then even shooting the film in my house, and because we needed more locations, moving apartments during the shooting so that we could have extra locations, and then shooting like at my local, having to shoot in my local bar, but because my bar would only allow us to shoot very early in the morning, but they closed at night, I had to go there in the middle of the night after everyone went home for shooting the last day's shoot, and then wait there until morning with the keys so that I could open it up and shoot the scenes in that bar. And then, I didn't sleep for the whole entire film shoot, not 1 second. And then afterwards, having to handle the international film festivals and the international distribution, and then distributing the film myself in Japan. And, in Japan, the way that a film is distributed is for an independent film. In order to get people to come to the cinema, you have like events every single night. Like you bringing other film directors or actors, and you do talk shows after the film was played. So for like 6 weeks, every single day in the cinema, we had like talk shows that I organized and did the MC and invited the guests. And then after every talk show, you have to drink with the directors till the morning. So I would drink till morning and then go home and then sleep for like an hour and then go back to the cinema. And yeah, that was the director ended up at the last day of it going to hospital for about a week. And so
I
Wow.
was going to say that on its own, that sounds like an awesome experience. But if it's your job and it's repetitive and it's every single night, that must be a nightmare.
it's a nightmare on your body, that's for sure. I mean, it's fun, the whole it's like running a film festival and having like a red carpet premiere, but for like 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And it's great because I think going to the cinema is obviously such an important thing if you're into films. I mean, I know nowadays anything could be watched by a click of a button, but being in the cinema is not just great, but I think in Japan with independent films, the way we do this is we make it an experience. Like every Japanese super independent film, in order to get people to come to the cinema so that they experience the film in the cinemas, they do these talk events every single day that their film is playing. And it's amazing to see if you were to come to like Tokyo and like any evening show of any independent film, like there'll be like the cast and the crew will be there on stage, and it's really it's like a real like being at a film festival. And but in order to get different customers in every night, you have to like have a lot of variety. So you'd be like, so I'd have to get like a different director, a different talent or something, and even just trying to find like strange ways of like getting strange people that weren't connected to the film to come and do a talk, because you don't want to have like the same directors every day, because then the same people come and watch the film. So like I think one time like I got like a wrestler, like a female wrestler and a male wrestler. This guy called Ladybeard. He's lady. He's quite famous. Like no, he does like heavy metal. He dresses like in like a sort of Japanese cosplay, but he has a beard. He's an Australian guy actually, and he works in Japan, and he does things like heavy metal, but also does like wrestling with like this female wrestling idol. I mean, and I would have people like that come to the cinema and do talk events so that we get like different audience to come to watch the film, because the people who were interested in that would never watch our film, but it's a way of getting people to come and watch the film that we'd made. So every single night, I'd have to think of what sort of guest, and then be able to schedule that guest and then get them to the cinema, and then do talk events with them, and then bring them out to eat and drink after every night. So it's for one person, it's quite hard to be honest, and quite tough on your body. But it's definitely an experience to look back upon, I guess.
Definitely. I mean, I would spend a lot more time at the cinema if I knew that I was going to be getting crazy events like that attached to the films that I'm going to watch. That does sound brilliant.
Well, it depends on the film, obviously. I mean, you're not going to get for that like a boring drama, but it depends also on the people involved. I mean, if you were to see like a Nishimura film, like these Meatball Machine and all that, I think they invite pretty crazy guests to do talk, and I tried to vary it up as much as I could. But whether or not it's a crazy event or not, I think a lot of people that are losing their passion for going to watch movies in a cinema is mainly just because you can watch it at home anyway at the click of a button for a lot cheaper. But if you were to be in a cinema with the cast and the crew and be able to talk to the cast and people involved with the film after the screening, I think it would really make you want to go to the cinema, and make you paying that cinema charge of £15 or whatever it is, wherever, make you feel, give you a lot more value for the money. So I think that experience itself is important for everyone involved. And I think Tokyo really has that, not just Tokyo, many cinemas and many places in Japan has that. And that's really why I love working and distributing in Japan, because in England, I could barely get any of my films, even like films like One Cut of the Dead. It's like impossible to get in the cinemas there, because they're just showing like just studio films. And even if it's art house, it's just the Cannes films. But in Japan, you can have like the most so super independent films get played in cinemas for like 3 weeks. I'm not just talking like a one-off screening. I'm talking like 3 weeks for like a no-budget film.
Yeah, we don't have enough of that over here, sadly. But luckily that, there are enough festivals and independent cinemas to have enough interesting films on for people who want to seek out the more obscure films. I've got to say, Adam, I love the kind of grassroots approach you've taken throughout your career with Third Window Films and all the different roles that you've taken upon yourself to learn. And I'm kind of curious as to which is the most favourite part of your job, your most rewarding part of it?
I think, yes, the most rewarding part is doing something that I can feel that if I hadn't have done it, then, for example, that film might never ever be seen, or that film that this director wanted to make might have never been made, or those are the things that reward me. So, like I said, going back to Takashi Kitano films, I love Takashi Kitano more than anything, and I love films like Fireworks, but me releasing them is a bit pointless. I don't get any joy of releasing them, despite the fact that Fireworks is one of my favorite films of all time. I didn't get a joy of releasing it because if I hadn't have done it, somebody would have. But the films like, for example, Legend of the Stardust Brothers, if I hadn't found that film, then it would have been, to this day and for the next how many years, been lost. And it's such a crazy film and unique film and a wonderful film that it would be such an awful thing for a film like that to have never been released. And I think that I get a lot of, I feel really happy and excited, and it brings back my passion to doing this, because obviously doing this sort of thing for so long, you lose a lot of the passion that you have and a lot of the will to live half the time, to be honest. But yeah, if it wasn't for the work I did, then they'd never ever be seen. Then that really makes me feel happy, even if that movie doesn't make any money in the end. It's just I feel like it would be a waste, and I feel it would be so disappointing for a film like The Legend of Stardust Brothers to never get out there, and that for 35 years it had never been seen overseas, and in Japan it wasn't even known of. So, I think I do feel so happy that film is now starting to reach a large audience worldwide. I put years into it, and that's really one of those things that rewards me.
That's such an amazing segue too, because you shared 2 films with us from your Vimeo streaming service that we could talk about a little bit today, and obviously The Legend of the Stardust Brothers is one of them, and I think it's a pretty good example of what you talked about earlier too, about the directors coming up in the 80s and the drugs and the music and the weirdness, because this one feels a bit like, not sure if acid trip is the best description, but it's a mad film, it's a crazy film, it's a creative film. It mixes up so many different aesthetic expressions and just has so much fun with all of it. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what made this film so special to you.
That film is I mean, when you talk about cult cinema, I think a lot of people in the world, oh, that's such a great cult film, Rocky Horror, all that, but a lot of the time, cult films only become cult films as we know them when they're mainstream. Most of the cult films nobody's seen of, and it's like if a tree falls in the wood, does it make a sound? It's like, you see, it's not really a cult film until it's mainstream. And I think the Legend of the Stardust Brothers is my idea of what a real cult film is, because of the fact that film should be massive. The people that are involved with that film, it's insane. First of all, it's the directorial debut of Tezuka Osamu's son. Tezuka Osamu, maybe his name nowadays doesn't have the pull that it used to, but anybody knows of Astro Boy or Kimba the Lion. I mean, Tezuka Osamu was, in essence, like Disney, the Walt Disney of Japan. And if anybody watches anime or reads manga, like, that's somehow connected to this guy, Tezuka Osamu. I mean, he's really, unfortunately, everybody nowadays knows of Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli, but Tezuka Osamu and Tezuka Productions was the most important aspect of anime, why anime is big nowadays. And his son made this film as his debut film. So it's, we're talking one of the biggest names in Japanese culture. His son makes this like crazy, like acid trip type of a film and the people that are involved with that, like other than the fact that you have all these massive manga artists like Monkey Punch, who did Lupin the Third, and Yoshimura Genki, who did like a Sailor Moon, like that are starring in this film. And then you have like people like Kurosawa Kiyoshi, Cannes Film Festival winner Kurosawa Kiyoshi in the film, and Daihachi Yoshida's in the film, another big Japanese director. And all these massive names are Ozaki Kiyohiko, who's one of Japanese most famous singers of the time. Everyone's involved with this film, and this film, nobody knows of this film, even in Japan. I mean, you think maybe those people like Tezuka Osamu or like Ozaki Kiyohiko might not be so well known overseas, but like even in Japan, this film was completely a bomb. And I guess that's what makes a sort of cult film in essence, like anything, not just like a tiny, super independent film that nobody's ever heard of that, you know, becomes cult because, I don't know, it's so bad or something like that. Like a cult film in essence, in my opinion, should be something that should have been something that everybody knew of, and for some reason it didn't, because it was too crazy. And you know, that's why I think this Stardust Brothers is so interesting, because there's no reason why everyone in Japan shouldn't know of this film, but there were so many different aspects that came around it at the time of its release, and it just bombed. And it bombed so bad when it was released in Japan that everyone connected to the film just completely forgot about it. They were all traumatized by it. And the director didn't want to make another film afterwards for years. So it's sort of all these things led it to becoming more and more forgotten. And luckily, I was able to see a 35 millimeter screening of it, at a one-off screening in Japan many years ago. And I thought, why does nobody know of this film? Why is this film never been released overseas? And I spoke to the director and I said, just let me remaster this film and let me bring this to the world. And he let me. So we cleaned it up as best as we could, considering it was shot on 16 millimeter, but a lot of the original film had been lost. So we had to piece together 35 millimeter theatrical prints of it, and we cleaned it up as best as we could. And then I had to bring it to film festivals and start to create a word for this film that had been unknown of. So it's not like you could look it up on a book somewhere, because it had never been released overseas. So I had to generate word of mouth by bringing it to about 30 film festivals, and then start selling it to some companies worldwide, distributed it myself, put out the vinyl myself, and then sold it to like a company like Mubi, who played it worldwide and therefore made it more and more well known. So it was a real passion project of mine, to be honest. And I think in a few years' time, that will be thought of as like the cult Japanese Phantom of the Paradise or Rocky Horror Picture Show. And I think once it becomes mainstream, it will be known as cult.
It's funny that you mentioned Phantom of the Paradise there, because that's what it kind of reminded me of when I was watching it. You know, it's just got all these bizarre musical numbers and these brilliant striking set pieces that straddle a variety of genres. You know, there's lots of comedy, there's elements of horror as well. And what was it that really made you fall in love with this underseen gem?
Well, I think the most important part of any musical is the music. And the funny thing about that film is a very strange way that the film was made. Is the film started off as a soundtrack that was made by a guy who wanted to make a musical film, but he couldn't make a film. So he made a soundtrack that accompanied this music film that didn't exist.
Wow.
So this soundtrack, The Legend of the Stardust Brothers, was actually made in 1980. The film itself was made in 1985. So the music was made first, and the music was made as if it accompanied a film. So, like I said, the music is a very important part of a musical, and the music was very, very good. Having that great music, I mean, it is sort of like lots of music videos put together. I mean, it's like a sort of MTV film, if MTV want to make a film in Japan at the time. But, I think that music with so many different genres of things, from anime to just like crazy car chase sequences, and I think it just came from the fact, like, all these, like, they were all young kids who made that film. Tezuka himself, the director, was only 22 at the time. And just the naive passion of just, like, doing anything they wanted to. Like, let's just put everything we can into this film, whether it sticks or not. And that's what made it sort of so like energetic and so charming. I think, the main two actors in the film are not actors. I think it's quite obvious by their acting, but they're musicians themselves, and it was just like, let's just like all get together with our friends and make this like crazy thing. And actually, talking about Phantom of the Paradise, the director and the guy who made the original soundtrack were big fans of Phantom of the Paradise and all those films like Rocky Horror and American cult films of that generation. I think they put all that, they were like just like dorks, like geeks, and they put everything, all these like strange inspirations from what they'd seen into like their own, mixed it up with their own culture and made this film out of it. And if you watch the film to the end of the credits, which I know a lot of people don't watch nowadays, the film actually is dedicated to Winslow Leach, who is obviously the main character from Phantom of the Paradise. So they put a lot of homage in that respect.
Yeah, it's a very interesting film, and the Phantom of the Paradise connection does make sense. What I saw a lot of people comparing it to on Letterboxd was A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles film. It does have that sort of energy. When I watched it, and the comparison that came to mind for me was Pink Floyd The Wall meets Scooby-Doo. Just that combination of sort of like an elongated music video, like Pink Floyd The Wall, plus some of the craziness of Scooby-Doo. But yeah, it's also just a borderline surreal film. There's a part where they're eating each other with different forks and like eating a small version of themselves. And yeah, it's completely bonkers, but like in the best possible way. And like it's downright hilarious at times. Like they're performing these songs in these super saturated colors, and then you have cut to these black and white audience reaction shots of the audience simply not getting the music. So yeah, and a completely awesome film, which has like so many references from like American stuff, but also UK stuff. I think like A Hard Day's Night would be an inspiration.
Yeah, I think a lot of those people, obviously, they're involved from that time. I mean, also Monty Python and things like that were really big in Japan at the time, and I think that sort of like surreal aspect of British culture in that respect also really found its way into what they were doing creativity wise, and I think that's why you get a lot of those directors from that time who made those sort of energetic and creative films. But the thing about that film is, it's a product of its time involved, and they actually all got together, the director and the cast and the crew, and made a new version of it a few years ago, and it's awful.
Well, for the first thing that comes to mind there is when Miyazaki Hayao watched his son Goro's first film, and he just walked out midway and had a smoke. But but it was also been a little bit awkward for you because obviously you produced Tezuka's Barbara as well. So was that just a long process of not speaking about this movie?
Yeah, I mean, Barber itself was also a very troubled production, and I'd spent a few years working as this completely fully independent film with like the Uchida Eiji films like Low Life Love and other cults, and Barber it was a film committee film, but because unfortunately of the Stardust Brothers, I was so excited and so passionate about that film. Then when Tezuka asked about me coming in to help him make Barbara, I thought, oh yeah, of course, I must, because this guy gave us the Stardust Brothers. But I should have actually spent a little more time thinking about the brand new legend of the Stardust Brothers and realized that maybe he wasn't the Tezuka of old. But I think the film Barbara it's a bit disappointing, speaking very frankly, because there were a lot of things that we couldn't do creativity wise because of the film committee system, and also because of the massive names that were involved with the film, that the big actors. So I can't speak so fondly about the film because it was 3 years of my time that I feel was really a bit wasted. Because I think the film could have been something a lot better if there hadn't been so many big names involved. To be honest, I think Christopher Doyle especially is somebody who likes working off the cuff, and when you have massive idols that are playing the lead roles, I think it really kills the creativity on set, and it doesn't allow for any off the cuff passionate work. And Tezuka himself, I think, also had to work within that. So it's a bit. I don't really like to talk about the film so much, and even though I should, because I do obviously want people to see it.
And you're distributing it.
I'm distributing it because I need to make sort of the money back that I lost from that film. I mean, the thing is, yeah, I mean, hopefully people don't listen to this, the people that buy it, but it's not that terrible of a film, but it's just, maybe I think, I'm overly critical as well, especially of films that I produce, because I'm quite a controlling person. I put so much into things that if it doesn't turn out the way that I want it to, I do feel a lot harsher on it. And I'm very harsh about all the films that I've produced, including Land of Hope especially, and of this. I know that there are a lot of fans of Barbara, and it won some awards and played at some big film festivals, and there are some people online that like quite a lot. But personally, I'm looking at it in a very strict and very harsh eyes, and I'm looking at it in a way of what if we had done this and that to it, and it's quite hard, I think, doing these big things, and I should have learned initially with the problems with Land of Hope and also Fuku-chan or Fuku Flats, and I need to go back into super independent films, but I think my wife will kill me if I spend like 6 weeks in a cinema again. Maybe I wasn't married at the time, I think. And when I was doing those films and in the cinema and drinking till morning every night, and I think especially I had a kid recently, and I think it has made me realize that I can't do those things as much, and maybe it's maybe I've become a little more conservative, and my back hurts and all these things that when you get a bit older, I guess.
Well, congratulations anyways.
Thank you.
But you also shared one more film with us, and it might be a film that puts a more positive spin on what we were talking about earlier regarding the lack of great new Japanese films, because this is a brand new film. It's Beyond the Infinite 2 Minutes, and I mean, at least to me, this was such a fun ride, and it's obviously done on a shoestring budget and just with a very unique concept. And I mean, on the face of it, it's a very different film from The Legend of the Stardust Brothers, because obviously the Stardust Brothers is over the top. It has all of these effects, and it's so crazy. And Beyond the Infinite 2 Minutes is essentially set in 1 or 2 locations. It's like it's a very shoestring, but they both have this kind of wonderful energy about it. You can really feel that they're having fun making it. So maybe you can talk a little bit about why you picked this film, what really spoke to you about it, and how you're distributing it right now and how it's doing.
Well, the best film to compare it to is One Cut of the Dead, and that was a film that also I handled worldwide film festivals and international sales and distribution and everything else in the same way that I'm doing with this film, Beyond the Infinite 2 Minutes. And it's the One Cut of the Dead of 2021, even though it was released in Japan in 2020. And it went on the same trajectory of One Cut of the Dead in the fact that it was a debut film director. It was done as a sort of workshop film. In Japan, you have these films that are sort of like super independent films that are made for like schools or made for like film festivals. One Cut of the Dead was made for a school. It was actually all done by actors who paid to be in the film as part of a process in which they learn to act and they make a film at the same time. It's quite a common thing in Japan, these workshop films, as they call them.
That's a very different way of financing your films, for sure.
Yes, exactly. And unfortunately, with One Cut of the Dead, all those people that paid to be in the film that ended up grossing $30 million in Japan off a $25,000 budget, they didn't get paid for it at all. I mean, that's not. If it was me, I would have definitely paid them. But I was only handling the film for the international side, and I unfortunately couldn't do any of that. But One Cut of the Dead, it was made for this school, and it was released. The way that this workshop worked was that they would make it for this school, and then they would screen it in this cinema, the same cinema for every one of their workshop films for 2 weeks. And every day the cast would go into the cinema, and it ended up being this film that sold out in that cinema for like 3 months, and then got picked up by the Japanese cinema chains and played nationwide in all the big cinemas. And Beyond the Infinite 2 Minutes was made for a very, very local film festival called the Shimokitazawa Film Festival. And it was this film festival was done in a cinema called Tollywood, which is about a 30-seat cinema in Shimokitazawa in Tokyo. And they made this film just for this small cinema and this small film festival. And this film also, like One Cut of the Dead, sold out in that cinema for like 3 months and got picked up by the big Toho Cinemas chain and went on to becoming this massive nationwide hit. Not to the same extent of One Cut of the Dead, because it was during COVID. So this was last year. So it only, obviously that really affected the amount of people that could see it. But considering it was made for like $25,000, it still got over 20,000 admissions for during COVID and during all these cinema restrictions. So it's quite big film. But yes, like One Cut, I got in there very early and took the worldwide rights and now bringing it to film festivals. So it's only just been starting to play film festivals. It's only played 4 or 5 film festivals so far, but it's already won 6 awards in those 4 or 5 film festivals, and I've booked it into film festivals all around the world. So we'll be being, by the end of the year, I'm sure it'll be a very big film, and then I'll distribute it on Blu-ray and DVD and such afterwards.
One big part of the film's appeal for me was the fact that it's done in one shot, or given the appearance of one shot through some clever editing, quite similar to One Cut of the Dead as well. And we also did a podcast episode focused specifically on films that were done in one shot. So it's a shame that we hadn't seen that before we did that episode, because it definitely would have been included. I'm curious to find out if you've seen an influx of these kind of one-shot filmed approaches done in Japan since the success of One Cut of the Dead. And obviously, that we now know that Beyond the Infinite 2 Minutes has been a success in its native country as well. So have you seen quite a few copycat approaches trying to emulate that success?
Yeah, there've been a few that just aren't popping to mind at the moment, but I know that there have been a few One Cut of the Dead similar one-cut films, and obviously the workshop. I mean, this concept of workshop films obviously has been going on actually for a while in Japan, but because of the success of One Cut of the Dead, obviously, it's a big way to make a lot of money. So there have been a lot more of these workshop type films that have been coming along. I think Beyond the Infinite 2 Minutes is the reason why it's done in one shot is that the film is actually made by a theater troupe called a Europe Kikaku. And as they're a theater company, they're used obviously to one shot because theater is one shot. I mean, actually, One Cut of the Dead was based on a theater play, and that's why it had the one cut, because it's based on a one cut theater play. So I think that allowed them to use small locations and make it one cut to because it's how they'd probably be doing it anyway if they were doing it in the theater. But yeah, they're obviously, like anywhere in the world, when something hits, they're copycats, and it's no different than Japan. I mean, they always try to do things like one-cut films that are similar to One Cut of the Dead, and because everyone in Japan knows of One Cut of the Dead because it was such a 1 in 100 years type film. I mean, you couldn't even Blair Witch Project is some sort of an example, but I don't think Blair Witch even is that comparable to One Cut of the Dead. I mean, One Cut of the Dead is so much smaller, and also being a foreign film to make it so much internationally. And the director of The Artist is just remade One Cut of the Dead. So it's a Academy Award winning director has made a remake of it already. So its success is unparalleled.
That's brilliant, Adam. Well, thank you so much for bringing it to our attention, because we all absolutely loved Beyond the Infinite 2 Minutes. So I can't wait till it gets a general release over here, and I can hopefully buy a physical copy to add to my collection.
Yeah, it'll get even One Cut of the Dead. I mean, that film, I brought it to over 100 film festivals, and Fright Fest played it 3 times sold out. And then when I went to the Prince Charles Cinema saying where One Cut of the Dead had played 3 times sold out at Fright Fest and said, can you play this for a week? They were like, no, we'll give you like 1 day in the afternoon. It's just so hard to get a theatrical, general release in England. So I hope that Beyond the Infinite 2 Minutes can get out there in the way that One Cut did. But even One Cut only played like 20 cinemas, and each cinema had only played for like 2 screenings. So I don't really think it'll get out there in the cinema, which is unfortunate because it's a good film to watch in the cinema with people. But at least it'll get out on DVD and Blu-ray. And I'm sure in Australia, I mean, I'm talking to some film festivals in Australia right now about the film, so I'm sure it'll get into a few cities in Australia towards the end of this year, and then hopefully it can get picked up for distribution. So it's more accessible than some of the minor films that I've handled in the past.
Okay, thanks, Adam. That's really good to hear, because I did really enjoy Beyond the Infinite 2 Minutes, especially like the whole like paradox notion, and they're scared of doing something different into the future in case they break the paradox. It reminded me a lot of 12 Monkeys, the Terry Gilliam film, but like on a smaller budget. But yeah, very interesting film, and yeah, I'd love to see it playing one of the film festivals over here.
Yeah, hopefully more people see that, because it's not, the ending does fizzle out a little bit, and it's not Obviously, it does have some problems because of its minor budget and sort of amateur approach. But I think that does add to its charm. And it's all things are done. It's 70 minutes, so it's a very easy and fun and I think it's a fun film to watch with an audience. To be honest, I think it's really something that people will enjoy at film festivals and people will talk about because it's something different. And I think people want to see something, in this chaos of COVID in the world. Some people want to see something a little short and fun and different and something they can talk about afterwards and makes them feel a bit cheerful.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, yes, it might fizzle out a little bit at the end and destroying some easy tropes to put the plot along, but I mean, the basic concept is so unique and so interesting. Just this idea that you have a loop from 2 minutes in the future and that's all, and you can make a full movie out of it with so much charm and excitement. I mean, you really don't see that many films that manage to just get that core concept and just build on it and have so much fun with it, and it's just absolutely amazing to see. And it's also amazing that it came from such a low budget place. So do you think that this type of film, so either the workshop film or just these very low budget festival films, might be the future for really interesting creative films from Japan?
Yeah, I mean, the whole concept of workshop films, they have very, very bad, and they have very, plus and minus points. I mean, the minus points obviously are these examples like One Cut of the Dead, where the film ends up becoming very successful, and the people who have starred in the film have essentially paid for it to be in it. And I think, if you were to explain that to anybody in the West, I'm sure they'd be pretty pissed off, for the people that are involved. But at the same time, it's the energy and, just energy, I guess, of all these people that are passionate about making something. And I think not having a lot of money sometimes can give the best creativity because you don't have to answer to anybody. You can do whatever you want. The films that I've done, like Low Life Love, I mean, they were just really no budget films. Really had no budget whatsoever, and I think that allows so much creativity, even if it's a lot of work, because you have barely any staff and to work with, just a few people on set, and it's tough, but it's fun and allows you to do so much. And I think because of the success of those films like Beyond the Infinite, 2 Minutes, and One Cut of the Dead, hopefully we'll see a lot more energetic. And also, I think entertainment is something that it's a funny thing to say for when previously we were talking about Japanese missing out on human films and having only fantasy films. But actually, Japan don't make that many entertainment films. They make a lot of boring human drama, but not many entertainment films. They're very poor about making fun films. Of course, they have the few Rurouni Kenshin films, but those are big international productions by major studios like Warner Brothers. But in terms of independent films, they don't make entertainment films in Japan. They make human dramas. So due to the success of One Cut and Beyond the Infinite 2 Minutes, I think hopefully we can see more Japanese independent entertainment films. And that I think will be really interesting if it does come to light, because I want to see unique, entertaining films. Living in Japan and going to the local independent cinemas and watching boring dramas all the time. I mean, I love dramas if they're good, but most of the time they're not. And I think it'd be nice if they could make some more crazy films like they did in the past.
Definitely, I hope so too. And I think with that, we can go on to our Q&A section, because we have a few questions from our forum members. So, Tom, do you want to ask the first question?
Yeah, sure. So we have a question from Beavis, who's a fan of 1980s 8mm punk cinema. And he wants to know, did the Tsukamoto box set do well? And if so, is there any chance of seeing more box sets from this scene? He says an early Sono box set, same thing, and a proper release of Noisy Requiem would be heaven sent.
Well, the Tsukamoto box set is not mine, it's our release. So I think that is quite a common misconception. I released all the Tsukamoto films, but I released them individually over the years, since 10 years ago. So the box set that our released, I think it did well, but it was also convenient because all the rights to the film were handled by one person. and it's easy to make a box of films that are handled by one rights holder. And box sets can be very complicated because if you're dealing with different companies that own the rights, it's very hard to negotiate on a film-by-film basis for films that are in a box itself. So, for example, the Sion Sono films are all handled by many different companies. And on top of that, if you want it on Blu-ray, the films need to be in the correct definition. And as I said, the Tsukamoto films, I had worked with him to remaster all of them because he owned the rights, and it was very easy to remaster them. But the Sion Sono films, the rights are all over the place. There's no high-definition materials. It's, I couldn't afford to do, even if I could afford them, I don't think it'd be possible because of rights, to remaster everything myself. I mean, you do still need the Japanese companies or other people involved in the actual remastering process because it's expensive. I know Sion Sono had a box, which I have myself on DVD, the early years box that was released in Japan, but they're all titles that don't have high definition materials. And the thing about Sion Sono himself, different to Tsukamoto, is that Sion Sono, as I said, is living only in the past, in the present. He lives only in the present and in the future. He doesn't want to look back at his old films. So he doesn't want to remaster them. He doesn't care if they get re-released. And sometimes you need that, like with Stardust Brothers, Tezuka, had a will and he had the rights to allow me to do it. And with the Tsukamoto films, he also wanted to remaster them as well. But if the director is not interested and if the rights are a problem, then it's not easy to do that. So I don't think there'll be a Sion Sono box, unfortunately. And I don't think a lot of those Sion Sono films will be able to get out there in Blu-ray because of all these things. But I guess, for some of the other peer directors of the time, I think maybe there was a thing recently called the 8mm, 8mm Madness series, which were remastered films from peer film festivals that included Ishisogo, Tsukamoto, Yamamoto Masashi, Sono Shion, all those things. And that also brings a rights issue. I wanted to re-release that box because they had been remastered, but the problem with a lot of Japanese films of that time is the music rights. Because they were done as independent, but they didn't clear the worldwide music. So I think a lot of things that were connected to that 8mm Madness they were allowed to play at international film festivals because they cleared the music for that, but they weren't allowed to be sold for distribution because of music rights. And the thing about Stardust Brothers is that Tezuka owned the music rights because he owned the soundtrack, so it was able. But if you look at, for example, Tsukamoto Shinya's film Phantom of Regular Size, which was part of that Pia and 8mm generation, the rights are not cleared. So all those films from that time, because of music rights, they can't be screened, they can't be distributed overseas. So it's sort of killed that. I mean, I know for Ishisogo's Crazy Thunder Road, his debut from 1980, I've been trying to clear the music for that for like years, and I've just managed to clear them. So it cost a lot. So that is one film from that era that I will be bringing out on Blu-ray, maybe later this year or beginning of next year. But that would be the first time the film has ever been distributed overseas because we finally could clear the music rights at a high cost. So there's so many issues to do with distribution, to be honest, especially for older films. A lot of people, can you put this film or that film out? But it's not as easy as that.
That's so frustrating, and it also more or less answered Beavis' follow-up question because he had a long post about how he really wanted to actually release that exact collection of films. But he did also ask if you have any intention of diving even deeper into, the cult or even experimental cinema scene from the 80s as well.
That's also, it comes down to materials. I think a lot of the films that were made, I mean, going back to Tsukamoto and also Stardust Brothers, those films that were independent, they just happened to have directors that held the rights. I mean, a lot of those films that are independent, there's still the rights are issues because some of them were made by companies that have gone bankrupt and therefore the rights become very complicated to deal with, or the masters get just damaged. It's a lot. It's not easy to get those films out there, to be honest, and that's why you only tend to see the major films like especially Tetsuo and all that, because there's also a market out there. If you're gonna spend all the money to remaster them, which is not cheap in Japan is very expensive to remaster things, you need to have at least titles that are big enough that people will buy. I mean, having to remaster like some very, very cult films that nobody's really heard of, it's a bit pointless. Even if you were to get the rights and get the materials, like the cost involved in remastering them when nobody really wants to when you can't really sell them, it's just not possible. But then if you look at, for example, the Pink films that I did, the Pink films actually came about because there's a company in Germany called Rapid Eye Movies, and they bought a scanner. They were able to get the masters to Germany, and they remastered them themselves, and therefore I was able to release them alongside with this Rapid Eye Movies company. But in the majority of cases, Japanese companies won't allow the prints to go overseas. I mean, I've tried so many times with speaking to companies like, let me have the print and I'll bring it to Germany where my friend owns a scanner and we'll scan it and therefore you'll have a brand new master of the film and you can use that to re-release in Japan, but they won't allow the print to go overseas. So it's really it's as frustrating for me as it is for a lot of people that have written in, I think.
Okay, we've also got a question here from Mantua or Taprock, who's one of our French users. He's written, clearly Third Window has a pretty clear brand identity, but how essential do you think it is for a smaller distributor to focus on a niche? Have you any plans of expanding your niche?
If anything, my niche has probably gotten a little more narrow, to be honest, because I was doing Korean and Hong Kong films in the past, and I've ended up focusing solely on Japanese films. I think it's just because I live in Japan and I speak Japanese and I'm so connected to Japanese culture that it's become like this. Though in essence, I do actually have a variety of films that I'm releasing nowadays that are a little more mainstream in some respects, and therefore maybe slightly less niche in that. I mean, I'm not just handling, for example, just experimental Japanese films or just horror films. I mean, there's quite a variety of films released, so it's niche in the fact that it's only Japanese cinema, but within that, there's quite a variety of films. I don't think it's going to open up. So I think this is about it.
Our next question is from Lone Wolf, who is a very big fan of your label. And he says, I own several Third Window films, and I have a dozen questions about what movie they may release or not, but I'll try to refrain from asking them. However, I'm interested in hearing about your Pink box sets, and if there was any kind of backlash to them given the environment of perhaps seeing these films as sexist or controversial today.
To be very frank, those films, as I just mentioned, came from a company called Rapid Eye Movies. And the owner really loves Pink and experimental cinema. To be honest, actually, I'm not a big fan of, when I was a teenager, I was really into learning about Pink cinema because it was so interesting in the way that it was in its relation to Japanese film history and the many directors that came from Pink cinema and the many political aspects of Pink cinema. But as I got older, to be honest, I think I became a little more conservative, and I don't watch Pink films nowadays. And in fact, I'm quite shy when it comes to any sex on screen. I usually fast forward it. So I didn't think myself I would have released any Pink films because of any sort of backlash, and also because they're not really my taste nowadays. But this Rapid Eye Movies company, I really respect and love the owner and always try to help him out. And he had remastered them, but he needed to sell the rights to raise a little more money. So I said, look, I'll help you out, of course, and I'll release these films in England. And that's what I did. So they're probably less personal films compared to any other films that I've released. And in terms of backlash, yes, I thought maybe there could be, but then I think, having surprisingly, places like the BFI took them onto their video on demand platform, and then Mubi took them worldwide. And I think, yes, there could be a backlash, but then again, I think if you think about it, I mean, I know a lot of people don't think nowadays; they just blow up on the internet and write on Twitter and all that. But if you think about, first of all, they're not that bad and they're not that overly sexist, and yet they are quite important in Japanese history and especially in history of Japanese cinema, and Pink cinema in many aspects is as well. So, I think first of all, if you have one film directed by the person who went on to do Shall We Dance, there's a lot of importance into his early films, whether they're pink or not, getting out there. So, yeah, maybe I think I was a little surprised how wide they went in the end.
That's great, Adam. So I've got a question from Underhund, and he wants to know how streaming is faring in Japan. So at one time it looked like a dream solution to seeing more Japanese films in the West, but it hasn't really materialized yet.
The thing about Japan, and going back to the point of dealing with Japanese companies and how hard it is to deal with them as an overseas distributor, is that Japan, the reason why a lot of Japanese films don't get overseas and the reason why the distributors have found it hard to work with Japanese companies is Japanese films make their money back in Japan. It's very rare. I mean, it's like Indian films and Bollywood. They are made for Japanese and they make their money back in Japan. So they don't really think about the international aspect of their films because it's really pocket change to them. If it was, obviously directors themselves might want their films to be seen at film festivals and get seen worldwide, but directors don't make any decisions about how a film is released overseas or even within Japan because of this film committee system. So I think because the Japanese mindset of companies is thinking of Japan, and because Japan is still old-fashioned in the way that people go to the main financial aspect of a film is to cinemas. They make their money in cinemas, and then video rental, and video on demand is just it's not a big thing here. And because it's not a big thing here, they don't think about it being a big thing overseas, and therefore, they don't really. It's hard to deal with Japanese companies if you were to want to buy video on demand rights. So that's why I think a lot of Japanese films aren't making it onto video on demand worldwide when, yes, there should be an opportunity to. But I think recently there are the Japan Foundation, who are a sort of government-connected body that are located in Australia and in England. They run film festivals and they promote Japanese culture, including Japanese film. Recently, they've been trying to run their own platform to promote Japanese cinema worldwide. I know they've done it through COVID by doing online film festivals, and now they want to do it on a permanent basis. And I think that might be one way, because they have a lot of money and they're government connected, that they will bring more Japanese films streaming worldwide through their own platform.
So following on with the streaming questions, we had another question actually from Lone Wolf. And what he realized, and a few other users have pointed it out, is a lot of third window films are also showing on Mubi, which is a service that he has. I have, a lot of us on the forum have Mubi accounts. So he was just interested in what the story is about the partnership between your company and Mubi, and whether more of your releases will be popping up on Mubi.
The partnership is only in the fact that they are a video on demand service like Netflix, and they buy films. And as somebody who owns the rights to films, obviously I want to make some money back from those films by selling them to companies like Mubi. Unfortunately, Mubi don't really pay much for the films because of the fact that they need to put so much money into getting the films out there in terms of subtitling them in many different languages and marketing and all that. So, I've had a few films that I've managed to sell to Mubi, but there's no real sort of like official partnership in that respect. Just like maybe films that I bought the rights. I mean, in terms of worldwide rights, like Stardust Brothers was one that I had the worldwide rights, and they were interested in it, and they bought it to play on their platform worldwide. But it sort of depends on the films, because they're also quite selective about what films they play, and they like Netflix. They like to buy worldwide rights on films because it's not really worth them buying per territory. So there aren't many films that I have worldwide rights on, and therefore there aren't that many that I can get on there.
All right, thank you. I'm sure some people will be sad to hear that. So I have another question from MJF314, who asks, has Third Window Films ever considered expanding to TV, especially for Japan? He says there's a lot of good TV dramas that haven't been released with English subtitles yet. Would this be something you'd be interested in putting out?
Not especially, to be honest. I think, first of all, the costs of making. I mean, maybe he's talking about streaming, but then again, it's not easy to negotiate streaming rights for Japanese anything. As I previously mentioned, it's very hard to deal with Japanese companies in terms of streaming, but in terms of physical, the cost of subtitling all the episodes, the cost of putting them on multiple discs, and the cost of the BBFC is a big problem. In America, you can release a film unrated, but in England, you have to release a film certified by the BBFC. And the BBFC are charged by minute of screen time, which is why I always try to buy short films. And I don't like buying long films because it costs thousands of pounds for them to certify a film. It's insane when you think about they, in essence, could be stopping many films from getting out there because we're talking thousands of pounds it could be for a long film, like Love Exposure or something. So it's really, if it's a TV series, you're talking hours and hours and hours, and that's thousands upon thousands of pounds just to get a certification. It's insane costs, and yes, something that I definitely won't do.
That does sound like there's a lot of work involved with that, so I don't blame you at all, Adam. We've got a fascinating question here from Niles. When you produce films, do you give the directors carte blanche, or were there times when you intervened as a producer? And if so, what were those moments?
Usually it's in the post-production that I interfere, or I have interfered. I think the problem with Japanese cinema is post-production is a very small thought in Japanese films. Because of this, the culture of this film committee system, it's all about getting the sales points into the film. So as I mentioned, the music company get the music in there, the talent agency get their stars into it. And therefore, they're just really making sure that film, those parts are added in the film. And whether the film is good or not is a bit of an afterthought, because it doesn't have to be good if those parts in Japan, because, if you have a very famous idol in the film, you easily make money whether the film is good or not. So I don't think they put so much effort into making a film look good or to making a film tight. I mean, they never get involved in the post-production. And because of that, I think the Japanese directors they're not very good about post-production either. I mean, I think the one big problem with Japanese cinema is that all the films are too long, including, for example, Sion Sono. I mean, with the exception of Love Exposure, surprisingly. A lot of Japanese directors, because nobody's sitting by them and telling them maybe you should make this tighter, maybe this scene is irrelevant, etc., they just put everything that they've shot into the film. They don't want to cut out a scene because there was a hard scene to shoot or this and that. So you have a lot of, I think most Japanese films could be made much better if they, for one, were better edited, and if two, they had more work done in them on post-production in terms of making them look better. So what I've done as a producer is a lot of making the films tighter in editing and making them look better in terms of grading them and sound design and these sort of things. I mean, usually the directors actually aren't so interested in that. All the directors that I've worked, they're not interested in the post-production side of things. And I am, so I've really done a lot. For Love and Other Cults, I took out 1 hour of it, actually, because it was became very over-bloated. But usually what I do is the director will have the film as he wants. If you tell a director saying cut this or that, you'll make them get a bit too emotional, and whether or not they think it's probably a good idea to cut it or not, they might not think in that way. And if somebody's telling them, like anybody, if you tell somebody don't do something, they won't listen to you. So what I do is I take it and I re-edit it myself, and then I show it to the director and I say, what do you think about this? Do you think this is better like this, or maybe we should put your version and my version, and we should mix it up, and we talk and we make it better in that way. So that, yeah, I wouldn't tell a director like you have to remove this or not, but I sort of hint in a very strong way maybe at some point.
Okay, we have a final Q&A question from Rob shared with us. What releases are you most proud of?
Because I forget a lot of the films that I've done because I'm doing so many, and I'm sure there are a lot in the past that I'm very proud of. Like Confessions was one that was a big hit in England. It played a lot of cinemas and it sold to television. So I'm very proud of that, obviously. And Fish Story is another one, and Love Exposure is another one. But then again, I think probably, yes, the films that I've put in a lot of time and effort, like Stardust Brothers and Low Life Love, are probably ones that I'm more proud of. But maybe that's only because they're in my recent memory and I forget what I've done, what happened in the past. So yeah, I'll stick with those for the time. But I'm sure if I were to think in a few minutes, I'd probably say something else.
It's a pretty good list, anyways, Adam. So thank you so much, and thank you so much for sitting down with us today. Do you have any last shout outs, or even now that you just have our listeners all to yourself, is there anything you would like to tell them before we finish the interview?
I just have to apologize for the fact that I ramble on a lot and I go on very tangents, and I wonder sometimes if people really can follow what I'm talking about, or if people have probably got very bored a long time ago. And I apologize ahead of time, always. And I always think that I'll try to be a little more concise, and it never actually happens. So that's all I can say is if there's anything you want to, or anybody wants further clarification or have any questions on, anybody can email me at any time. Anybody, and I will speak to anybody. I'm always replying to anybody by email, and if you send by Twitter or Facebook or Instagram any messages, I'll reply immediately. So if anybody has any questions or wants to hear a little more, anytime, I'm always available. And I thank everyone for trying to understand what I'm talking about.
An absolute delight, Adam. It's been very easy to follow, and it's been just great to listen to you.
I'm sorry for dragging on, and I hope you can edit. You can make this. It doesn't last for so many hours. You could run a marathon, listeners, I think.
No, I don't think you will need much editing. I think this is pretty much perfect as it is, actually. It's been an absolute delight.
Well, I thank you for setting it up, and I thank everyone also who's had any questions, for having interest and being excited about Third Window Films, because it's such a small personal thing that I'm always excited that anybody finds out about it.
That's brilliant, Adam. Thank you so much. You've been an absolutely wonderful guest to interview. It's been a real pleasure this morning. So thank you again for all of your time. It's much appreciated.
Thank you. And yes, enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.